Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's presentation by Sarah Schulman on her new book, Let the Record Show. Uh, Tonight, Sarah is going to be in a conversation with Chris Freeman from USC. Chris got his doctorate from Vanderbilt in English and Queer Studies. He's been a professor at USC since 2006. And he's the co-editor with James Berg of several books on Santa Monica's own Christopher Isherwood, most recently the book Isherwood in Transit from last year. So Chris and Sarah will talk until a little after 8 o'clock, then they'll take your questions. Please put your questions in the chat, and I'll call on you when the time comes. So Chris, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you and welcome to everybody who's here. That includes those of us who are here live and those of us who will be watching this later recorded for world history. It is such a thrill for me, Sarah, to be here with you. We had dinner in Chicago, where you are at the moment, a couple months ago, and I said I would love to do something with you for this wonderful new book. And then the next day I got an email from Jeff. So here we are. Sarah, you and I first met in Key West in January of 1997, which puts us into the timeline really of this work, of this new work of yours. It was at a conference that turned out to be quite momentous, Literature in the Age of AIDS. You were there as one of the keynote speakers, Tony Kushner, Edmund White, Andrew Holleran. I think Mark Doty was there. It was an incredible experience. And for me, it feels like full circle, really, coming all the way back around to being able to do this with you tonight, this event with you tonight. In 2016, the writer Hugh Ryan, who recently published a book called Queer Brooklyn, a wonderful book, wrote a wonderful retrospective of your work for the LA Review of Books. And he said this, talking about your work. In assessing the power of Schulman's voice, you, quote, place a high premium on accountability, responsibility, and consistency. And it shows in the way that you chase an idea from book to book, from fiction to nonfiction, and back again. And I think that is so insightful because I think your work is so much about ideas. And you said to me in an interview that we did for the Gay and Lesbian Review that in your nonfiction especially, you're trying out ideas. You're trying to put ideas into the conversation and sort of seeing what happens from those ideas. And so I'm really excited to talk with you tonight. You've written more than 15 full-length books, novels, including Maggie Terry and my favorite, The Cosmopolitans, and then back to Rat Bohemia and People in Trouble, you know, classics from back in the day, plus incredibly important nonfiction. I've taught both Conflict is Not Abuse and Ties That Bind, your brilliant book on familial homophobia, which obviously was very helpful to you in writing Let the Record Show. So you guys, this remarkable, incredible oral history of ACT UP New York is such an impressive accomplishment, Sarah. And I think you've given us a record of a time that people are going to be sorting out for the next 50 years, right? And tonight, I'm going to really be talking to you about a 40-year timeline. So in order to kind of start that timeline, which goes back to about 1980, you're a New York native. You left New York to go to Chicago for University of Chicago. Oddly, coincidentally, here you are back there. So talk to me, let's pick up with when you got back to New York and sort of started your career as baby activist.
Thank you so much, Chris, and I'm just so delighted to be able to do this with you, and our friendship is so important to me, so thank you so much. I dropped out of college. I came back to New York in 1979, which is the year the Hyde Amendment passed, which restricted funding for abortion. So the reproductive rights were under attack at that point, and in 1980, Reagan was elected president. So my role at that time was I was a journalist for a number of grassroots, community-based gay and lesbian and feminist newspapers. So at the time, there was absolutely no coverage of our communities in mainstream press, and what existed was completely inadequate and untrue. And so there were newspapers in every city. There was a gay paper and a feminist paper, women's paper usually, and then there were some national papers. And there was a whole cadre of journalists who were working for free, who were out there trying to find the stories and trying to represent us to the community. And I was one of those people. So I was 21 or 22 years old. And one of the big issues in New York at the time was that we did not have a gay rights bill. And so I was working for 3 papers at that time: Woman News, which was the straight and gay feminist newspaper; the New York Native, a little bit later, that was the gay male newspaper; and Gay Community News, which was the gay and lesbian socialist newspaper out of Boston. And so I would go to City Hall. Ed Koch, the closeted mayor, was in charge at the time. And I'd say, Mayor Koch, Sarah Schulman, New York Native, when are we getting a gay rights bill? Then in 1981, the patterned virus that later became known as AIDS was first identified by science. Now, it's important to say that we now know that AIDS has existed for about 100 years and probably was in the U.S. in the 1940s and certainly was in New York in the 60s and 70s.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
But science did not recognize the pattern until 81. So when we say that this is the 40th anniversary, it's really the 40th anniversary of the recognition of the pattern. And the first public statement was the New York Times story, July 3rd, 1981, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco.
Right.
Now, in order to understand that headline, we have to go back to what life was like for homosexuals in 1981. Gay people were a profoundly oppressed minority, and this includes gay white men who today are considered a privileged category. But homosexual sex was illegal. In fact, the sodomy laws were not overturned until 2003, as a matter of fact. New York City had no legal protections for gay people. You could be fired, you could be kicked out of an apartment, you could be denied hotel and restaurant accommodation. Familial homophobia was a virulent social norm, a huge force of history, and street violence against gay people was a form of entertainment. It was called gay bashing, and there was no place to turn. The police were part of the problem.
Well, remember, that's such a huge plot line in Torch Song Trilogy, right?
Right.
The character, Arnold's partner, right, is bashed to death.
Exactly. So it was into that environment that AIDS was launched, and it also was a time of enormous stigma against homosexuality and a lot of pseudoscience theories about the, quote, cause of, quote, homosexuality, which was understood as one thing. People were attributing it to, quote, biology. So there were theories like you were gay because of your hypothalamus gland.
Right.
It was real pseudoscience. And so when there was a virus that was located on gay men, initially it was confused with the illness of homosexuality itself as it was understood. And so the original name for this virus was gay-related immune deficiency, GRID, which is absurd to us now. I mean, today we would never say gay cancer. We know that cancer is not gay. But at the time, there was a concept of homosexuality as a biological illness. And that frames the beginning of how AIDS was understood. I was already in the community as a journalist, and I covered many early AIDS stories. Some had social justice angle. For example, pediatric AIDS was a huge issue in New York City. A lot of people were born HIV positive. I covered the fact that women were excluded from experimental drug trials. I covered homeless people with AIDS, but I also covered I had some strange assignments. The New York Native sent me to cover when the health department shut down the gay bathhouses, which is interesting because women weren't allowed in the bathhouses. I'd never been in a bathhouse. But that was because it was so chaotic. Journalists were dying, editors were dying. My editor at the Village Voice, Robert Massa, died of AIDS. We didn't know what the stories were. This whole time, the mainstream press was completely ignoring AIDS. So it was for us, the grassroots journalists, to create what the stories were.
Right.
So that's how I came into it. Now, the first 5 years of the AIDS crisis, 40,000 people died in the United States. We now see the numbers over 600,000. The government did absolutely nothing. Pharmaceutical companies did nothing. They tried to recycle failed cancer drugs that they held patents for. And the concept was that they were looking for a pill that you would take that would fix your AIDS, because that would be the largest market share. But actually, the AIDS is really like an umbrella term, like cancer. It's different in each person. It means that your immune system is not working, and each person manifests reactions to that differently in what's known as opportunistic infections. So people got dementia, or went blind, or the nerves in their legs swelled, or they couldn't process nutrition. And what people with AIDS really needed was treatments for those opportunistic infections. Right. But those were smaller market shares. And so pharma had no motive going that way.
Right.
So, the first 5 years, the gay community basically was trying to reconstruct some kind of community-based social service system that people with AIDS did not have access to. And also the fact of familial homophobia is very significant in this, and a lot of people did not have family support or family network. So there was
to put it nicely, right?
Yes, right, exactly. So Gay Men's Health Crisis, for example, had a buddy system where people would volunteer to just hang out with somebody who had AIDS, who maybe
bring
had
food, bring food, those kind of things. And also during that time, safe sex had to be invented.
Yes, so safe sex was invented a few years into the crisis, basically by Dr. Joseph Sonnabend and by two activists, Richard Berkowitz and Michael Callan, who tried to get people to use condoms. And it was very controversial at the beginning because many people experienced AIDS as an encroachment on gay liberation and sexual freedom. There's a famous story David Halpern tells of being at dinner with Foucault and Edmund White in Paris. And Edmund White is bringing the news of AIDS to Foucault, and Foucault doesn't believe it. He thinks it's a scam to try to stop gay men from having sexual freedom. And of course, he died of AIDS.
Yeah. Early, 1984.
Right.
Right. So before we move into ACT UP, which comes into existence in 1987, right, in spring of 87, talk to me just briefly about the relationship in the queer community between lesbians and gay men in the late 70s, early 80s.
I mean, except for personal friendships, there was very little political interaction. There was a feminist movement, and lesbians were struggling to be part of that movement. That movement was very anti-lesbian, and there were a number of lesbian purges in different realms of the feminist movement, which have not yet been significantly historicized. So we don't really have records of that, but that's work that needs to be done.
Like the great Ivy Bottini, who was a wonderful leader in the lesbian community and gay and lesbian community, and one of the founders of ACT UP LA, actually. She was booted out of NOW.
Yes, NOW had it, but also radical groups. I was in a group called Carassa, was a reproductive rights group that also had a lesbian purge. So that was going on there. Gay men had been kicked out of the left early on. The Communist Party had expelled homosexuals. The civil rights movement had famously sidelined Bayard Rustin. So existing movements did not want queer people. That was clear. But the sexism of gay men and the incredible differential in earning power, in basic rights, in employment rights between men and women was so profound that there was really very little interaction at that point. And certainly the battle for abortion rights, gay men really did not participate in that, with a few exceptions, Scott Tucker and a few other people, but it was just a handful.
Okay.
So yeah, it was two different worlds.
Right. And of course, all that changes in ACT UP, which was
and for interesting reasons. I mean, I know for myself, because I had been kicked out of the reproductive rights movement in a lesbian purge.
In the lesbian purge. 82, okay.
I was very shy about getting back involved with a women's movement. And the advantage of going into ACT UP, and there were a number of us from the reproductive rights movement, lesbians who came into ACT UP, was that we knew we would never be kicked out for our homosexuality.
Right.
So that was attractive, and that
It's
was
a
one of
coalition, right? There's the word, coalition, right there.
But also they needed us desperately, and we were treated with a great deal of respect because although there were older men who had been part of the gay liberation movement, younger gay men, for the most part, had not been politically active before AIDS. And the women and people of color in ACT UP tended to have a lot more political experience. And those men needed that experience. They didn't know how to run a meeting. They didn't know basic principles of how to think politically. And they were very open to all of that. And women like Marian Banzoff and Risa Denenberg and Maxine Wolf brought in these concepts from the feminist women's health movement of patient-centered politics that had, come from feminism, or people like Jamie Bauer, who had been in the women's peace movement, brought in nonviolent civil disobedience training, and these types of ideas, which were centerpieces of ACT UP, which almost everyone I interviewed who was in ACT UP mentioned, came from the pre-existing feminist movement. So, it was very appealing to be in these relationships with these men.
Okay. So a reminder to everybody, ACT UP is an acronym, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And it turns out it's a really good acronym because every single word in that matters. So coalition we get in terms of the cross-race, cross-gender, and even there were a few straight people in ACT UP, right? You interview a mother, right, who's so important in that organization. But also, so as ACT UP is forming in the spring of 1987 in New York, shortly thereafter, 6 months later, is the big 1987 March on Washington. Is that a place where ACT UP spread the word, and that's kind of where other chapters started opening up?
I don't know the exact answer to that, but there was a politicization that occurred right before ACT UP was founded in March of '87, which was the Bowers v. Hardwick decision in the Supreme Court.
Speaking of sodomy laws, right? It upholds the sodomy laws.
The Supreme Court upheld sodomy laws in the middle of a mass death experience and epidemic. And gay people were furious. And there were very angry demonstrations in New York and in Washington without permits. This created more of a politicization. Because, there was an assimilationist tendency in the gay movement. And there were people who were afraid to stand up against institutions. And even with 5 years of death, they were still afraid to stand up. So only when it became clear that the government had completely abandoned us, not just Reagan, but the court, then you start to get a lot more anger. And right before ACT UP began, there were two affinity groups that were founded. One was a graphics collective that created the poster Silence Equals Death that many people have seen with the upside down.
So that pre-existed ACT UP?
Yes.
Okay.
And they put that up all around New York City. And then there was a ZAP action group called the Lavender Hill Mob. Now, ZAP action is a tactic that came from the gay liberation movement. And a ZAP is something that you do when you are completely outside of power, because it basically means bursting in and fucking up everything.
Right. Mess up Dan Rather doing the evening news or something.
Right. Exactly.
Or St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Yes, exactly. And there's a larger theme there, which is, ACT UP used to say no more business as usual. But what does that really mean? It really means that if you are going to oppose the New York Times, the government, science, universities, art museums, every institution of power, then you're not going to try to get a job at the New York Times, right? It means giving up your ambition for success, this traditional idea of success, which required people to be in the closet and to behave.
And to assimilate.
Yes. And you had to give that up in order to make significant paradigm shift in the culture. And that's really what made ACT UP so radical.
Right. So would this be a good time to talk about something that I think is a really important point in your book, the inside-outside approach of ACT UP?
Sure, and I want to say that, in my book, I call it inside outside, and people in ACT UP, some people use that term, but many people in ACT UP never knew that this strategy existed because ACT UP did not theorize itself and it did not debate theory. So, the way it functioned was in the 1980s. It's hard to understand this now, but the government was almost entirely white and male. And the private sector was almost entirely white and male. And the media was almost entirely white and male. So even someone like me as a white lesbian, there was actually no one who looked like me in power. Like there was no Rachel Maddow, there was no Tammy Baldwin, there was, So when you're dealing with the powers that be, you're dealing with white males from elite backgrounds. And ACT UP had some white males from elite backgrounds. And, like Larry Kramer had gone to Yale with the guy who ran Bristol Myers Pharmaceutical Company, or Mark Harrington, who was one of the more brilliant leaders of ACT UP, had gone to Harvard, right? And so
Peter Staley worked on Wall Street.
Yes, JP Morgan. So those guys, when they went in to meet with pharma or with the government, they were meeting people who were from their class. And, that's the inside strategy. And one of the tough questions that I ask in my book, and I ask this sincerely, is if we had insisted that people of color and dykes were the ones to go sit at the table, would we have gotten anywhere? Would there ever have been any kind of identification? Because it was so restricted in terms of who had power at the time. And what's interesting is when you compare some of the campaigns, so this elite group was able to get meetings with pharma. There's stories of catered lunches and all kinds of identification, and they could focus on empirical questions. Where the Women's Committee was trying to win benefits for women with AIDS. And let me just give a little background so people can understand why women with AIDS had such a different experience than men with AIDS.
Because people don't know this history, Sarah. That's why this book is so important, because you pull from the mouths of the people who were there doing the fighting. So tell us, what was the deal with women at this time?
So in the 1960s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and many of them had children that were born with no limbs. And so there were a lot of suits against pharma, and pharma had to pay out millions of dollars. So at that point, they said no more women in experimental trials. So
because of pregnancy, right? Because of pregnancy and childbearing.
Potential pregnancy,
right.
So anyone, it didn't matter whether you were pregnant or not, anyone who was, quote, childbearing age could not get experimental drugs. Well, when there's no treatment for something, experimental drugs are the only treatment. And women with AIDS tended to be poor, often women of color. They did not have access to private insurance. They didn't have doctors. Yeah. And so when the government defined AIDS to have what an official diagnosis would be, they did not include the kind of symptoms that only women had, like severe pelvic inflammatory disease or endless yeast infections. And so women would die of AIDS and never qualify for official AIDS diagnosis. So there was a campaign to get the government to change the definition of AIDS to include women's symptoms so that women could get benefits and could get into experimental drug trials. And a 29-year-old lawyer named Terry McGovern, who was a poverty lawyer, sued the government. And ACT UP's Women's Committee ran a campaign with women with HIV. It took 4 years, and they finally won. But it took them 2 years before they could get a meeting with Fauci. I mean, so in the same organization, the elite men could go in and have their meetings and get access, and the women could not get in. And that's how you really see the differential. And what's interesting is this win, changing the definition, not only got women benefits, but it's one of ACT UP's longest, farthest reaching victories. Because today, every woman with HIV in the world who takes a medication knows that it was tested on women because women got into trials. So it's had a very, very long reach. So this was the inside-outside strategy. And, at the beginning when there were no treatments, everyone was sort of in the same boat. But once treatment started to develop, who had access to them was really different across the board. I mean, another interesting constituency inside ACT UP were active and former IV drug users. And they were fighting to have needle exchange in New York City. And there's a story by Richard Elovich, who was one of the leaders of that group, that he confronted Fauci again and said, you know, you're not enrolling needle users in these experimental drug trials. And Fauci said, well, they're not reliable. And Richard said, well, you can't just write off an entire class of people. You know, so
isn't that the perfect example, Sarah, of science having the way they do things? If we're going to run a drug trial, we have to have people that you can rely on. Like,
well, the question, I mean, what you're raising, that's a very important comment, because one of the big questions in this whole history is whose point of view do you inhabit? If you're a scientist, yeah, you want the cleanest data possible. But if you're a person with AIDS, no person with AIDS wants to be kept out of a trial or be given a placebo.
Right.
And because of this patient-centered politics that ACT UP learned from the feminist women's health movement, we looked at everything from the point of view of people with AIDS. So we opposed placebo trials. And we said that the standard of care should be
people will die on placebos.
That's right, exactly. And so what the IV drug users had to do, and this was when Dinkins was mayor, so we had a black mayor, and the black community was very ambivalent about needle exchange. This was in the early days, and the concept of harm reduction had not been popularized yet. It was abstinence or nothing, right? So the former and current drug users in ACT UP took a very dangerous strategy, which was that they blatantly did illegal needle exchange in New York in order to get arrested.
Right.
Went to court and argued a necessity defense, and they won. And they made needle exchange legal in New York City. And this transformed the rates of infection for IV drug users in New York. But they could have lost.
Right.
They had no other access to power. So what's really interesting about comparing these three constituencies is that you see that your playbook is determined by your social position, even in the same organization. If you don't have access, you have to be messier and more high risk in terms of what strategies you use.
And more disruptive, much more disruptive, right?
Absolutely.
So, all right, so what I want to do now is talk about sort of how you were able to write this book, which is because for the last, 15 years, you and Jim Hubbard have partnered up to do the ACT UP New York Oral History Project.
Right.
And out of that came a brilliant documentary in 2012, and I'm actually going to show the trailer for that in just a couple minutes. But tell us about that project, and because without that project, you could not have written this book.
Right. So as I said, I was an AIDS reporter before ACT UP started. Then I joined ACT UP in 87. I stayed till about 92. Then 96 is the protease inhibitors, which are the beginning of the drugs that actually keep people alive. And then in 99 is the internet revolution. And this left ACT UP in the dust because we were a pre-internet movement. We didn't have email, we didn't have YouTube, we didn't have anything, and none of our stuff was digitized. So if you searched ACT UP in 1999, you would find almost nothing. 2001 was the 20th anniversary of the recognition of the virus. And I was listening to the radio, and somebody said, at first America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. And I was like, oh no, this is going to be one of these fake stories about the benevolence of the dominant group. So my collaborator, Jim Hubbard, and I realized that there was an emergency here. And also, we've both been very motivated by a sense of responsibility to our dead friends. Jim and I, for decades, this has driven us. So we started the ACT UP Oral History Project with the support of Urvashi Vad, who was at the Ford Foundation at the time. And for the next 18 years, we interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP. We posted the transcripts of their interviews at our website, which is actuporalhistory.org. And we've had 14 million hits. And we made everything available open access. And Jim and James Wency have preserved almost 2,000 hours of archival footage, which we made available open access at the New York Public Library. And then in 2012, Jim directed the film United in Anger, A History of ACT UP. And then Jim and I literally took the film around the world. We showed it in Russia, we showed it in Palestine, in Lebanon, in India, in Brazil. We showed it, we met people with AIDS all over the world, and we showed the film everywhere. And so then by the time I decided to write this book, I had all of this data, and it had to be cohered, but we created the data.
Right. So, Jeff, let's watch the trailer for United in Anger, and everybody should know you can go on YouTube and watch the entire 100-minute documentary produced by Sarah Schulman.
Living in New York at that time was like crazy because people were getting sick every day. 3, 4, 5, 6 people that you hear about being sick.
We were very scared that the Reagan administration was going to put people with AIDS in internment camps. And I think that we came close to that in this country.
How deeply are Americans worried about AIDS? A Los Angeles Times poll found that 50% of Americans favor quarantine for AIDS victims. 15% said AIDS victims should be tattooed.
It was about people in power not caring about the lives of people who didn't have power.
Kramer delivered a fiery speech, and I remember he asked like half of the audience to stand up, and he said, "You're all going to be dead in 6 months. Now what are we going to do about it?"
Coalition to Unleash Power. We are a diverse, nonpartisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis.
Release those drugs! Release those drugs!
When we're activists, when we really act up, we have a big impact, and we get what we're demanding, and when we're silent, we don't.
We'll never be silent again! Act up! We'll never be silent again! Act up!
Was where I really got a sense of community.
I mean, I got the feeling then that people felt that lives depended on it.
Healthcare is the right! Healthcare is the right! Act up! Fight back! Fight it!
These drug companies are profiteering on our lives, and that we cannot accept that anymore.
I mean, Sarah, it must be powerful for you to even watch that trailer again. That's so personal to you, this project.
It's weird because, I have been I've never stopped working on this subject, but it's not the only thing I work on, but so I've never had that moment where I forgot about it and then I see it again.
Right. So now we're going to come to more discussion about your book itself. We've been talking about the whole framework of it. I just want to talk about the title for 1 second, Let the Record Show. I'm working on a project on Paul Monette, the LA-based writer who died of AIDS in 1995, just short of his 50th birthday and just short of the new drugs, right? If Paul had been healthier for 6 more months, he'd be a 75-year-old, probably professor somewhere and author of another 5 or 10 books. But in his diaries and in his book, Borrowed Time, he said, "We have to say we've been here." This was a comment in his diary from about 1985, when he was afraid everybody was going to die of AIDS, and this history, as you realize too, was not going to be told. So this idea of let the record show is, for you, I think, such an affirmative declaration of what your book really is. And it's an oral history project, fundamentally.
It has 2 meanings. I mean, Let the Record Show was the name of a exhibit that ACT UP artists created very early on at the New Museum, in which they likened it to the Nuremberg trial. And they had a fantasy that the people who were responsible for this mass death of our community and globally would someday be held accountable. But in fact, that never happened.
Never.
When Jesse Helms died, or when Ronald Reagan died, even the obituaries, they hardly barely mentioned their role in AIDS. And so I wanted this book to be that accounting. But the other issue was that ACT UP started to be mishistoricized as an achievement of a very small group of people, maybe 5 people or 6 people. And what that missed was that change in America is not made by a handful of individuals, even though we have a long-standing belief in the John Wayne, heroic individual who's going to ride in and save us. Actually, nothing works that way. In America, change is made by coalition. And so it was very important to me that activists working today, because we're living in a time where many people want change desperately and we all need it. And it's really important to understand how to get it by looking at movements that have had some kind of success. And so in my book, I talk about 140 people, most of whom have never been historicized before. Many of them are women and people of color, but many of them are white gay men whose contribution was completely overlooked in favor of this individual myth. So that's the other meaning of the title.
Right. And the first section of the book, so that brings us into, now we're just going to kind of look, because the book is book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4. And the first one is called Political Foundations, or How Change is Made. And it's about direct action, and it's about learning from other movements, right? And one of the people you talk about is Vito Russo, and the very important speech he gave. And you quote a lot of the speech he gave about, we're all dying here. Who's going to listen to us?
I mean, part of ACT UP's problem, it's interesting comparing, Vito's speech makes me think about COVID and the differences between AIDS and COVID, because COVID is a collective public experience. And it's talked about on the news and people talk about it at dinner. AIDS was like our private nightmare. And our fight was to get it into the public, and that was Vito's fight. But in the first section, I'm just trying to cohere what ACT UP's most successful strategies were that might be helpful to activists today. And there are many of them, but one I want to talk about is that ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement. And you could disagree and still do what you needed to do. So in ACT UP, if you there was a principle of unity. It was one sentence: direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was direct action as opposed to social service provision. So if you had an idea and I didn't like it, we would argue, because this was pre-gentrification New York culture and everything was on the table. But in the end, I would not try to stop you from doing it. If I didn't agree with you, I just wouldn't do it. And then I would go find my people to do the project that I wanted to do. And this kind of radical democracy really is what enabled ACT UP to have a big tent politic in which many different kinds of actions were going on at the same time with many different approaches in many different social sectors. And that is part of its success. And it's really important for today's activists to understand that, because there's a tendency to try today to push for homogeneity because we're in a very conservative time. And movements—
And people hate conflict. People hate conflict. Right?
We're also not in a time of freedom and expression and creativity. We're in a time of repression. But movements that try to force everyone into one analysis or one strategy have historically always failed. And you do have to have a bottom line of what your values are. But I think that this openness is a lesson that we can learn from it.
Mm-hmm. And you articulate that so well. And I think it's book 1 because of the urgency. If somebody's intimidated by an 800-page book, maybe they'll at least read the first 125 pages, right?
Okay.
And literally get the message. Okay. So book 2 is, and I again notice for the people who haven't read the book yet, art in the service of change.
Yeah.
Change
So
is
art—
a key word.
Art was very important in ACT UP. It was New York. There were very ambitious people, very talented people at the cutting edge of their fields, often especially graphic design and advertising, and it was pre-assimilation. So gay culture was on the outside of the culture and was more creative. This is not the banality of the rainbow flag and all of that, right? This is really cutting edge visual culture. And when I was historicizing it, I realized that if I only looked at galleries or museums, I was going to get white men, with one exception. But if I looked at nightlife connected to ACT UP, if I looked at performance art connected to ACT UP, then I found people of color. For example, the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus of ACT UP, they did outreach to Asian immigrants who spoke languages in which safe sex information did not appear. And they would go to Asian gay bars and wrap condoms in lucky red Chinese New Year's paper. And, you know, this type of thing that had never been recorded in histories of the movement. Or nightlife.
And you learned about that through an interview? How did you?
Yes, I didn't know. I was not aware of that at the time.
Right.
Because I was just like everyone else in ACT UP. I only knew what me and my friends did. ACT UP never theorized itself as a broadly. You know, people only really knew, and also because it was pre-internet, I think had a lot to do with that as well. Also, nightlife, the most important lesbian bar in New York City history, the Click Club, was run by two women of color who were in ACT UP, Julie Tolentino and Lola Flash. And then they had a men's night meet that was run by Aldo Hernandez, who was in ACT UP. So there was, you know, this kind of culture building and community building that was going on across the board. But you have to look broadly to get everybody, because these apparatuses of power were so racially segregated at the time.
And they're not on the wall at the Whitney, at least not yet.
Well, some of them are just starting to be. I mean, Lola's
exactly, but they weren't in 1990. They were not on the wall at the Whitney, right?
Right.
At all. And of course, we got all that incredible iconographic stuff from Grand Fury. You know, and the poster kissing. What was the quote? Kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do. Right.
Well, that's
that
how activists raise money, because they were not a 501c3 and they did not want to apply for grants or try to get government money because they saw themselves as a political movement.
So they sold merch.
Not a non-for-profit. What's that?
They sold merch.
That's right. They sold T-shirts. And Charles Hovland, who's one of the sources that I interviewed, the first time ACT UP went to sell T-shirts at Gay Pride, he went home with $30,000 in cash in his pocket. So that's how the community supported ACT UP, was by buying these pieces of visual work.
Okay, amazing. And we also should mention this is the era of the video camera that people could own themselves for a few $100 and carry around with them with a spare battery.
Yes, the camcorder was just invented at this time. So ACT UP was the first movement to have video activism, and there was no YouTube or anything like that. So ACT UP would actually snail mail video cassettes all over the world of videos of our actions, and that's how we communicated.
Amazing, right? I mean, people don't think about how these technological revolutions, you know, this is very kind of beta testing everything that a movement can do. The third section of the book has a quite provocative title as well: Creating the World You Need to Survive.
Yes, so ACT UP had a lot of amazing progressive components of people who had large visions for social change. So for example, Housing Works, which is the organization for homeless people with AIDS, that started as the Housing Committee of ACT UP. And in the chapter, I show how some men, some of whom had been actually gentrifiers, you know, had a complete change of heart and committed everything that they had to finding housing for homeless people with AIDS. Or insurance reform. A straight woman named Karen Timor masterminded a 5-year campaign in ACT UP to get rid of HIV as a pre-existing condition, and made hundreds of thousands of people eligible for private insurance. Or another example was when Haitians were incarcerated, HIV-positive Haitians were incarcerated in Guantanamo before it was for Islamic political prisoners. And ACT UP was involved in trying to get people out, and there was a Haitian Underground Railroad that members of ACT UP's Housing Committee were involved in finding people housing in New York City. So it was like problem solving for huge social problems. And I go in, and also fundraising. One of the interesting things about ACT UP, there were some people in ACT UP who were very elite, and then there were people who had no resources. But you didn't have to fundraise for your own project. So ACT UP had an art auction that raised $650,000, And the two people who organized it, one now heads the Hammer Museum in LA and the other heads the Warhol Museum. But this is when they were young and getting started. So when the Women's Committee was working with HIV positive women, they didn't have to fundraise to get money so that those women could travel to testify at hearings or stay in hotels. They could just ask the fundraising committee who had money that had been raised through the art auction. Or when the Latino caucus realized that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico needed support, they could just ask for money to fly to Puerto Rico, which they did, to start ACT UP Puerto Rico. So it had a democratic funding mechanism internally, and that's something that movements can learn from.
Did some applications for funding get turned down?
Not that I know of. No, I don't think so.
But as long as it was a direct action.
Yes, needle exchange was paid for, and
so as long as as you made your case of, look, this is a direct action and it's going to help X, Y, or Z, they would like
direct action to end the AIDS crisis. That's
it. And then we get to the final book. This book, the happy ending of this book is the postscript. It's not in this book, unfortunately, right? Because 1993 is one of the darkest years of the AIDS crisis, in my view, at least, because by then I came out in 1988, right into the middle of all this as a 23-year-old. So the last section of the book is called Desperation. So tell us why that title and what you're really trying to communicate with that idea.
After a few years of really incredible victories, after forcing pharma to change the way they approach treatments, forcing the FDA to make experimental drugs available even if they hadn't been approved, after forcing the government to change the definition of AIDS so women could get benefits, after making needle exchange legal in New York, after opposing the Catholic Church, after all these significant victories, there still was not adequate treatment. And people in ACT UP were dying in huge numbers, and the leadership was dying. And we were very young, and AIDS death is a terrible death. The person really suffers. And, it was, I mean, as Garance Frankie Ruda said in the book, I think we all just went a little crazy. It was so painful, and people turned on each other. And there also were real political issues about access involved in that separation, but it also was an emotional just frustration, both of those things. So in 1992, 12 significant members of ACT UP left and started a group called Treatment Action Group, which still exists, and ACT UP still exists. Hundreds of people remained in ACT UP, but it really devastated the organization. And as someone who witnessed the split but was not involved in it, most of us in ACT UP did not participate in this split. We would sit in the meetings, brokenhearted, and watch our leaders fighting with each other, And then so that took place, and ACT UP really dissipated. And then in '93, 3 key members who all belonged to the same affinity group died within 10 weeks of each other. And each one of them had said that they wanted a political funeral. That was Mark Lowe Fisher, Tim Bailey, who was a menswear designer for Patricia Field, and John Greenberg, who was an activist for alternative medications. And they knew they were going to die. They accepted that they were going to die, and they said the kind of political funeral that they wanted. And their friends carried it out. And it was dramatic. Tim wanted his body tossed on the White House lawn. And his friends literally took his body in a van to Washington and tried to do this. But when they arrived, the FBI was waiting for them, and it was very frustrating, terrible experience. So that's where I end the book, actually, in the chaos and the desperation.
So, Sarah, you mentioned John Greenberg and the political funeral he wanted to have. I wanted to have you read something from the book, and you and I talked about this, and you thought maybe this would be an appropriate, let's say, passage. I think it's on 629 in my notes.
Yes, I have it.
So give us, to contextualize this for us, and give us a little sample from this incredible moment in 1993.
So Mark Lowe Fisher was the first of these 3 friends to die, and John Greenberg had written a eulogy for Mark's public political funeral, but John could not deliver it. He was too upset. So when John himself died, we had a public funeral. We carried his body to Tompkins Square Park and opened the coffin. And at this funeral, Barbara Hughes read the eulogy that John had written for Mark.
Wow.
So this is John's eulogy that he had written for Mark, read in front of his body in the casket.
And were you there? You witnessed this?
Yes, I was there. Mark has once again crossed a boundary that each of us will sooner or later have to cross, whether we have AIDS or not, whether we are angry or not, whether we are afraid or not, and whether we have a Republican president or not. The truth is that each of us will one day follow Mark to that ultimate otherness and the final liberation. Let us hope that we can do it as consciously, actively, and as well prepared as Mark has. To the end, Mark was unafraid of the consequences of his actions, or if afraid, he used that fear to propel him onward rather than to paralyze him and stop him from fully living. Mark knew he was going to die. We, each of us, will also die. Mark's life and death, if it is to mean anything, cannot be trivialized by wishing it away or pretending that there could be any other end. Yes, we are in pain. We have lost a precious, powerful friend and colleague, but to avoid that pain by blaming it on someone else robs us of our opportunity to experience and learn from a greater consciousness, a larger self, a fearlessness. Acceptance of our mortality as Mark accepted his makes it possible to live life fully in spite of our fear, makes it possible to live life in real freedom because we are not afraid of the consequences of our actions. It is only after we see how trivial and illusory the political, social, religious, and physical barriers of this world are that we can begin to liberate ourselves from our fears and find our true power, consciousness, action, and fearlessness. Mark was honest with himself and with his life. He knew his death was unavoidable. He knew that to believe otherwise was to believe a lie and to give more power to the fear of the unknown than to the courage, strength, and love that we can choose to face the unknown with. And Mark chose this action today as his memorial, making even his death an act of empowerment for his community and giving each of us an opportunity to publicly declare our presence, our pain, our right to life, and our right to be proud of our deaths. We can learn from Mark's death, learn about consciousness, empowerment, fearlessness, and action, and follow his lead as I followed him through the barrier of our fears. Goodbye, Mark, and thank you for this final act of empowerment and generosity. Mark's final entry into his medical journal was, "Mind is clear. Feel like a connected whole." We honor that connected wholeness in our actions today.
I mean, that's an incredible moment, right? And it brings up a kind of queering of death, a reclaiming.
People in ACT UP were so authentically facing reality, and maybe that was its most radical position.
Mm-hmm. So I'm mindful of the time. We're getting very close to the end of our conversation, and we're going to see if we have some questions and comments. I think I want to end, Sarah, with 1990. I want to go back to the middle, I mean, literally the middle of the timeline of your book, which is 87 to 93. You were part of a plenary session with people like Essex Hemphill, who was the next speaker after you. And you each had about 15 minutes to talk to an audience. As you listen to the audience, you can hear people coughing. You're aware that people are quite ill in the audience. So can you set it up for us by telling us what Outright was? OUTWRITE, right? Outright,
Right.
and why it mattered at that time. and then we'll
So
watch the
Outright
clip.
was the LGBT, or as we used to say at the time, Gay and Lesbian Writers Conference. It was organized by a magazine called Outlook that was based in San Francisco. And 1990 was the very first year, and this was in the middle of the catastrophe. And it was clear that we had to come together as a community and address what was happening. And the keynotes, I believe, were Allen Ginsberg and Judy Grahn. And then there was an opening panel, AIDS and the Responsibility of the Writer. It was John Preston, who died of AIDS, Patrick Califia, Susan Griffin, myself, and Essex Hempel, who died of AIDS.
And you in these remarks, and Jeff will go ahead and cue up the, and again, you can watch this whole thing on YouTube. It's amazing. I've used it in classes I've taught, Sarah, on queer history, for example. But you talk about men and women together, queer men and women together, and you talk about the responsibility of the writer. And of course, we could extend that out to, the artist or the public figure or whatever. So Jeff, let's watch this clip. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long, and then we'll wrap up and open for some questions and discussion.
Sexual assault, economic oppression, and abortion. However, I know at the same time that gay men have been allowed to die because they are gay, not because they are men. And I also know from 2 years of involvement with ACT UP New York that there is a general understanding in that organization that sexism is not only wrong, it is politically inefficient. Additionally, on a human level, the fact that the gay community going co-ed is something that has certainly enriched my life personally and intellectually. Although it has been a strange experience in a country where women earn half of what men earn, to move from a movement of all women to a movement of men. I guess it's something akin to experiencing heterosexual privilege for the first time. We now have access to money, power, visibility, and resources that men move with in this culture. And I hope we can use these resources to benefit all of us. I'd like to say one more thing about responsibility. There are people in this room, many people, who would not be alive today if it wasn't for ACT UP. There is no book that got any drug released, any drug trial opened, or any service provided. Reading a book can help someone decide to take action, but it is not the same thing as taking action. And writing a book is not the same thing as taking action. That's right. The responsibility of every writer is to take their place in the vibrant, creative, activist movements along with everybody else. The image created by the male intellectual model of an enlightened elite who claim that their artwork is their political work is parasitic and useless for us. At the same time, I don't think that any writer must write about any specific topic or in any specific way. Writers must be free of formal and political constraints in their work so that a culture can grow in many directions. But when they're finished with their work, they need to be at demonstrations, licking envelopes, and put their bodies on the line with everybody else. We live in the United States of denial, a nation where there is no justice. The way we get justice is by confronting the structures that oppress us in the manner that is most threatening to those structures. That means in person as well as in print. Thank you. Thank you.
I love that girl in that video.
Yes, I was 32. Now I'm 63. There
It's
you
half
go.
your life ago. It's half your life ago, Sarah. And every word you just said in 1990 is true. And you still believe it. And that's what is so impressive about your work. And that's this gift of this book.
Thank you so much, Chris.
So, Jeff, do we have any comments or questions or praise for Sarah that you want to point us to for our last 10 or 15 minutes?
Well, I am going to invite the other attendees at this event to join us in the window.
Awesome.
So take a moment.
I see lots of friends in this room. I'm very happy. We are a small but proud group tonight. Sarah, what you said there at the end of those remarks, confronting structures that oppress us in a manner that is most obstructive. I think that was the word at the end, obstructive. You're speaking out of the middle of ACT UP, right? When you say that, you're speaking like you were probably at an ACT UP meeting a couple of weeks before this event.
Right. That's right.
So that's the energy and the commitment, the direct act. You were taking direct action by making that speech.
Well, that's what we were talking about earlier about no business as usual. But I also, I was not saying, I would never, ever, ever tell an artist what they should write about or what they should do. But I do think that the reception of the work deserves to be analyzed. Because work that makes the dominant culture comfortable and writers who get highly rewarded by that comfort doesn't mean that they should write it differently, but we have to, this is the materialist part of me. You have to look at what is the meaning of what's been created and how it is received. And that's not censorship at all. It's just simply extending the analysis.
Exactly. And the critique as well, right?
Because one thing that hasn't changed from those days is that lesbian literature is still not acceptable as mainstream American literature. And a lot of other things have changed in representation, but that has not. Mm-hmm. So it's hard. It's harder in a way today to get a lesbian novel published by a mainstream publisher than it was at a certain points in the 90s. Right. So some things have advanced and some things have not.
And it's not lost on you or me that this book on ACT UP has garnered you way more profile, higher, New York Times, New Yorker, various TV outlets, radio out, podcasts, way more
because
than you did, say, the Cosmopolitans.
Right, because it's about men. No, I'm quite aware.
Or at least that's what people think it's about.
Well, if all, it's primarily a history of a movement that was predominantly white gay men. And at the time, it couldn't get represented because those people's lives did not matter. Now we're in a different era and there's interest. And so, people are reading it who would not read any of my lesbian work. And I'm appreciate that they're reading it, but it does not extend.
Do you think it's a result of ACT UP and the, trying to move ahead with the drug, emergency use, so to speak, that anybody who, I'm guessing everybody in this event is vaccinated? Do you think we're partly vaccinated because of ACT UP?
No, I saw today that Moderna is announcing potential trials for an AIDS vaccine finally.
Yeah.
No, we have the same problems. Although we have we have treatments for people who are HIV positive so that you can live a full lifespan. Those treatments are not available globally. Your country or you have to be able to get access to them. And we have the same problem with the vaccine. The wealthy countries are hoarding the vaccine and the poor countries can't get them. And so, what we need is not national health care, it's a global health care system where everyone in the world can have access to the same care.
And COVID certainly told us that, right? If HIV didn't send the message, COVID sent the message.
Right, although it's not being enacted. WHO did tell us not to hoard the vaccine, but we still are. although we are also distributing, but
Right.
so it's the same issue.
Mm-hmm. But do you think the fact that we're able to, that those companies were able to have that emergency use approval, which is how we all got this shot?
Question, because, you know, at the time, I don't think we understood that forcing the FDA to make drugs available that hadn't been approved was actually benefiting pharmaceutical companies. And deregulation has resulted in things like this Alzheimer's drug being released that is probably ineffective.
Not working, yeah.
Yeah, so capitalists did benefit from those reforms in a way that we didn't fully understand.
Right, right. So Jeff, is there anything else anybody else we want to hear from? If not, it's late in Chicago.
Okay.
Well, thank you. I have not received any questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, there's trouble with the chat, but you should be able to DM it to me.
Sarah, did you click on the presenter list or on the participant list? If you didn't, you should do that because you'll know some of the people in the
yeah, I
list
see
here.
my friend Gail Suber.
Yeah.
I see your friend Jim Berg and Cynthia Hart. Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And Chris, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's not easy to digest a 760-page book and come up with.
Well, you know, I was reading it in the swimming pool in Florida back when you could go to Florida a few months ago. You remember I was posting all those pictures of me reading it? I should have used that for my PR picture for this.
There
on the
you
float
go.
with my friend Jane, who's in the event tonight. I was reading The Galleys, and I read every page and made all kinds of notes. See, it's underlined, all kinds of notes.
Right.
Because I was hoping to get to do something like this with you. So I've really, Jeff, thank you so much, and thank you to Santa Monica Public Library for hosting us tonight. And this is recorded. Sarah and I will both send it out into the world, as will Santa Monica. Maybe, Sarah, it should be added to the ACT UP New York video archive.
Maybe.
Right?
Okay.
Because that's what we've been talking about for an hour and 5 minutes. Thank you, folks, for coming. Stay safe. Sarah, thank you for this amazing book and for your wonderful work. We'll be keeping an eye out for what's next.
Okay. Good night. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.